And I'm pleased to say Russell Myers joins us now from the UK. Now, great man. I think we've all talked too much about Harry and losing his virginity, but there's one thing I wanted to ask you about before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, to use another term. I saw some criticism that potentially the woman who outed herself after being outed by Harry may well have been paid by a media organisation. I've got no problem with this whatsoever. This bloke made millions of dollars out of a book where he referred to her as older woman by 2 years. And as the internet has shown us, this story keeps going and going and going. I hope she got paid as much money as physically possible.
Well, hello, Paul. I think you totally hit the nail on the head, because any sort of controversy surrounding whether Sasha Walpole was paid is frankly ludicrous, because Harry has earned millions and millions of dollars off the back of not only trashing his family, but pretty much using people who didn't want to be mentioned in his book. And one of these people is this lady, Sasha Walpole. She had kept this secret for over 21 years, as she said. Didn't tell anyone, and you can bet your bottom dollar if she had have ever spoken about it, then Prince Harry would have been bemoaning his treatment in the press. He would have said that his life, was being targeted, and you wouldn't have heard the end of it. So fair play to Sasha Walpole. I mean, she's probably earned a fair, sizable chunk. I mean, it's pretty, inglorious is what Harry described it as, isn't it? And she said that she was sort of backed into a corner over it. So fair play to her. She's got her side out of it. So fair enough.
And the bit that I am most intrigued about here is not necessarily the story, but the description of her as older woman. Everyone who heard it or read it thought, oh, geez, hang on, divorcee, 20 years the older, old enough to be his mum. No, 2 years. 2 years. That's not an older woman. That's a friend.
Well, it isn't. I mean, she probably had a bit of an issue being described as that, because the dalliance, as it were, took place on her 19th birthday, and Harry was around 16, 17. I mean, he comes across as a pretty naive and juvenile, she said at the time, gave her a Miss Piggy Bear that he'd won at a fun fair. I mean, it goes from sort of the sublime to the ridiculous, this story. However, I mean, there was a list of characters, wasn't there? Elizabeth Hurley was named at one stage, the F1 presenter Natalie Pinkham, but it ended up being a 40-year-old digger driver from the countryside in the UK. And like I said, fair play to Shasta, because she got her side of the story out there, and Harry hasn't got a leg to stand on from this point, I think.
Will they, won't they, about the coronation? It's sooner rather than later. We're going to find out whether they have been invited or not. There's been some speculation in the past 24 hours that Prince Charles is close to the decision. What are you hearing?
Well, definitely. I think those decisions have to be made fairly soon, because not only you've got to get invitations out, and one may say, they can get an invitation right at the last moment, but there is a sort of crossing of T's, dotting of I's that needs to be done right about now. I mean, we're only 100 days away or something. So I think they will be there. I can't imagine that Harry will pass up the opportunity. Whether the family want them there is a different story. Of course, the king is not going to be so churlish to not invite them. And I think he'll pretty much leave the ball in their court. But lots of discussions whether they'll just pop in for 24 hours and leave to try and sort of minimise the controversy about their visit. But it's going to be controversial either way, isn't it, whether they do or don't?
Well, presumably there's a whole series of functions apart from the main event in Westminster Abbey. The assumption would be, all right, you can come to the coronation, but your flight arrives 40 minutes before the coronation and your flight leaves 40 minutes after the coronation, because for obvious reasons, he's not going to be on the balcony. He's not going to be there as a working royal. And anyone else is going to be poring over the body language of the interaction between the brothers and their wives.
You just hit the point there, because everybody is going to be poring over every aspect of their attendance. It happened with the Queen's Jubilee. Of course, then we had the late Queen's funeral. Their attendance was absolutely scrutinised. And this will be no different. Of course, there's a bit of a different aspect, of course, but from the funeral, this will be an occasion of celebration, one hopes. I mean, I hope they arrive 40 minutes before, because there's going to be thousands of people in London, and even without riders, they might have a bit of difficulty getting in. However, I can't imagine that Harry and Meghan will pass up the opportunity not to be seen alongside the royal family, because that is the currency at the moment. They've got to keep talking about the family. They've got to show that they're still associated with it, despite all the railings in Harry's book. So, I'm not a betting man, Paul, but if I was going to play a bet, I'd say they will be there.
Also, I've always thought that, as we've talked about in the past, that while people suggest the ball's in the King's Court to respond here, I think William is the one that people want to hear from about his reaction to all of this. Are you hearing anything out of the royal households or planning about not necessarily, peace meeting, but the idea that, they pretend to be friends a month beforehand, he flies over to the US and they meet somewhere neutral? Because if the first meeting is in the Abbey, then all of that analysis is really trebled, isn't it?
Well, I didn't have you down as such an optimist, Paul, to be fair. I mean, I can't imagine he's going to fly over. I mean, it might be quite nice to get a bit of winter sun over in California, but, as far as any sort of patching up of relations is, we saw that previously. We've had it at Prince Philip's funeral, then the late Queen's funeral. They're very cordial to each other. They spoke about what had happened, but Harry then spilled the beans in his book, didn't he? So I can't imagine that William will want to go anywhere near him, because at the moment they're all worried about if they say anything, it's going to end up in another book, in another TV interview, and so all the royals are going to want to keep their counsel. Now, if they do come over, I'm sure everybody is going to be pretty cordial. There's a bigger event at play. Nobody wants it to be the Harry and Meghan show, as it always seems to be. So it seems, give them an inch, they take a mile. So I think if they do come over, William and Kate are just going to get on with the business at hand. We've seen them out and about working, and business as usual for them, I think.
We talked a couple of weeks ago about what the British public's reaction would be. Do you still think that's the case, that if he does turn up, booing will ensue?
Well, it's a big question. It's not altogether ludicrous to even think of that, because there is massive polar opinion here, not only in the UK, but across Australia, the US as well. People are really on the fence. Everybody has read this book or heard about this book on one way or another, and it's really polarised opinion. So they've got their supporters. Of course, people will want to see them. There's an awful lot of sadness about the way that it happened, but there will be some booing. I was outside St Paul's Cathedral during the Jubilee celebrations, and they got booed then. So this is a celebration for the King. It should be about the royals who are here doing the job. So nothing's off limits, I think, at the moment.
Remember the booing of Boris Johnson? That was the beginning of his end on top of everything else. Booing matters, well and truly. Russell, lovely to talk to you. Keep up the great reporting.
Cheers, Paul.